Welcome back to Creepy Corner Stories, where the shadows come alive and the unknown lurks just around the bend. Tonight, we're taking a dark detour onto the endless stretches of asphalt, the highways. These roads have carried countless travelers on their journeys, but not all of them have reached their destinations. Beneath the hum of tires and the glow of headlights lies a sinister side: ghostly hitchhikers, cursed rest stops, and inexplicable disappearances. So buckle up and check your rearview mirrors, because tonight's tales might just have you questioning what or who you'll encounter on your next road trip. This is Highway Horror Stories. Let's begin, if you dare. Story: The Backseat Stalker. In the summer of 1998, Sarah, a 21-year-old college student, was driving back to her apartment in Tucson, Arizona. She had spent the weekend visiting her parents in a small town 2 hours away. It was late at night, and the long highway stretched ahead of her, empty and quiet under the faint glow of the moon. Sarah wasn't worried. She had made this drive many times before. She turned up the radio to keep herself awake, humming along to her favorite tunes. Somewhere along the way, she pulled into a small, dimly lit gas station to refill her tank and grab a quick coffee. The station was nearly deserted, save for an old man at the counter and a truck parked off to the side. As she left the gas station and got back on the highway, she couldn't shake a strange feeling, like she was being watched. She shrugged it off as just her imagination. It was late, and the empty road could play tricks on anyone's mind. About 15 minutes later, Sarah noticed headlights in her rearview mirror. A car was speeding toward her. She expected it to pass her, but instead, it slowed down and began to follow her closely. The driver flashed their high beams several times. Sarah was confused. "What's their problem?" she muttered, thinking maybe she had cut them off earlier or her taillights weren't working. She tapped her brakes lightly to signal them to back off, but they didn't. Instead, the driver flashed their lights again, this time more urgently. Her unease turned to fear. She pressed harder on the gas, her car picking up speed. The other car stayed right behind her, mimicking her every move. Whenever she switched lanes, they followed. Whenever she slowed down, they slowed down too. Heart pounding, Sarah decided to take the next exit, hoping to lose them. She veered onto a quieter side road, but the car was still behind her. By now, her hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and her mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Finally, Sarah spotted a gas station up ahead. This one was larger and well-lit, with a few other cars parked outside. She pulled in quickly, parked her car near the entrance, and grabbed her phone. The other car followed her into the parking lot, screeching to a stop just a few feet away. A man jumped out of the car and ran toward her, waving his arms frantically. He looked panicked, but not threatening. "Lock your doors, don't get out," he shouted. Terrified, Sarah hit the lock button and cracked her window just enough to hear him. "Call the police," the man yelled. "There's someone in your back seat." Sarah froze, her blood ran cold. Slowly, she turned her head toward the back seat, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. Shaking, she dialed 911. Within minutes, police cars arrived at the scene. Officers surrounded Sarah's car and ordered her to stay inside while they searched it. Moments later, they pulled out a man from the back seat, a disheveled stranger holding a large knife. The man had been hiding in her car since she stopped at the first gas station. He had slipped into the back seat while she was inside paying for gas. The driver who followed her had seen the man climb into her car and spent the entire time trying to warn her. The police arrested the man, who was later identified as a wanted criminal with a history of violence. Sarah was shaken but grateful to the stranger who had saved her life. From that day on, Sarah made it a habit to check her back seat every time she got into her car, especially at night. Story: The Vanishing Trucker. In 1983, Jake, an experienced truck driver, was hauling cargo through the desolate highways of West Texas. It was the dead of night, and the roads stretched endlessly under a blanket of stars. The only sounds were the rumble of his engine and the occasional howl of the wind through the barren desert. Jake was used to lonely drives, but that night, something felt different. As he approached a rest stop about 20 miles outside of a small town, he decided to pull in for a quick break. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for one old, rusty pickup truck parked in the corner. Jake grabbed a cup of coffee from the vending machine and returned to his rig. As he climbed back into the cab, he noticed movement in the side mirror. A man was walking toward him from the direction of the pickup truck. The man, wearing a tattered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, stopped a few feet away. "Mind giving me a lift?" he asked in a gravelly voice. Jake hesitated. He rarely picked up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of the night, but the man looked desperate. Against his better judgment, he agreed. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked as the man climbed to the passenger seat. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stared straight ahead, silent and still. Jake tried to make small talk, but the man remained unresponsive, his hands resting on his lap. Uneasy, Jake decided to focus on the road. After several miles, he glanced over at his passenger and froze. The seat was empty. Jake slammed on the brakes and pulled to the side of the road. His heart pounded as he looked around, but the cab was completely empty. The man had vanished without a sound or trace. Shaking, Jake continued driving until he reached the next town. At a diner, he recounted his experience to a waitress. Her face turned pale as he described the man. "That sounds like old Pete," she said quietly. "He was a trucker who died in an accident on that highway about 10 years ago. Some say his ghost still hitches rides, looking for the help he never got." Jake left the diner, vowing never to stop at that rest area again. He never saw the ghostly hitchhiker again, but he carried the memory of that night with him for the rest of his life. Story: The Ghost of Clinton Road. In the dense woods of New Jersey lies Clinton Road, a 10-mile stretch infamous for its eerie reputation. Many locals believe it's one of the most haunted roads in America. Late one night in 2005, a teenager named Alex and his two friends decided to test the legend. They had heard all the stories: phantom headlights, ghostly figures, and even a cursed bridge where strange things happened if you tossed coins into the water. Skeptical but curious, they piled into Alex's car and headed out to the isolated road. As they drove deeper into the darkness, the road became eerily silent. There were no streetlights, no other cars, and no signs of life, just the dense forest pressing in on both sides. When they reached the infamous Dead Man's Curve, Alex slowed the car. This was where most of the reported sightings occurred. His friend Danny dared him to stop. Laughing nervously, Alex turned off the engine. The car fell silent. They rolled down the windows, letting in the cool night air. At first, all they could hear were crickets chirping and the rustling of leaves. But then, a faint splashing sound came from the nearby creek. Curious, Danny grabbed a coin from his pocket and tossed it into the water as the legend suggested. The splash echoed through the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard it. A faint, childlike voice calling out, "Help me." The voice was soft but unmistakable. It sent chills down their spines. Alex turned the key, but the car wouldn't start. He tried again. Nothing. The voice grew louder, closer. "Help me!" Panic set in. Alex frantically twisted the key until the engine finally roared to life. As he hit the gas, his headlights illuminated the bridge, and they saw it. Standing in the middle of the road was the ghostly figure of a young boy, pale and translucent, with empty, hollow eyes. He stared at them, unmoving, as they sped past. When they looked back, the figure had vanished. Shaken, they didn't stop driving until they reached the safety of a well-lit gas station. When they told the clerk about their experience, she nodded solemnly. "People say that boy drowned in the creek years ago," she said. "He's been haunting that spot ever since, looking for someone to save him." To this day, Alex avoids Clinton Road and warns others to do the same. Story: The Lady in White on Highway 93. In 2010, David, a traveling salesman, was driving along Highway 93 in Nevada late at night. Known as the Highway of Death because of its long, isolated stretches and frequent accidents, the road was desolate under the starless sky. David had miles to go before reaching his motel, so he turned up the radio to keep himself awake. As he rounded a bend near a dry, rocky canyon, he noticed a figure on the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something far away. David slowed his car. It wasn't often he saw anyone out here, let alone someone dressed like that. Concerned that she might need help, he pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" he called out. The woman turned her head slowly toward him. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty. She didn't speak, but nodded slightly and walked toward the car. Uneasy but feeling obligated to help, David unlocked the door. The woman climbed into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. "Where are you headed?" David asked, trying to break the silence. She lifted her hand and pointed down the highway. "Just keep going," she whispered in a voice so soft it sent chills down his spine. David obeyed, gripping the wheel tightly. The air in the car felt colder, and a strange tension filled the space. After driving for several miles, he noticed something in his peripheral vision. The woman wasn't sitting upright anymore. She was slumped over, her head resting on her chest. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked nervously. No response. When he glanced at her again, she was gone. The seat was empty, as if she had never been there. David slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He pulled over to the side of the road, searching the area with his flashlight, but there was no sign of the woman. Shaken, he drove straight to the nearest gas station, where he told the attendant about his encounter. The man sighed and nodded knowingly. "You're not the first," the attendant said. "That's the lady in white. Legend says she was killed in a hit-and-run on this highway decades ago. Now she haunts it, looking for someone to take her home, but she never stays." David never drove Highway 93 at night again, and the story of the lady in white remains one of the region's most chilling tales. Story: The Phantom Truck of Route 6666. In the 1990s, a young couple, Mark and Lisa, decided to take a road trip across the southwestern United States. Their route took them through the infamous Route 666, often called the Devil's Highway, which stretches through the desolate desert landscapes of New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona. The road had a sinister reputation, with countless reports of strange occurrences, ghostly figures, and unexplained accidents. Mark laughed off the rumors as they drove late at night, the desert stretching endlessly on both sides of the road. Lisa, however, couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The moon cast eerie shadows across the landscape, and the air seemed unnaturally still. Around midnight, as they cruised along a particularly dark and empty stretch of the highway, they noticed headlights appear in the rearview mirror. A large truck was barreling down the road behind them, its headlights glaringly bright. "That guy's in a hurry," Mark muttered, keeping an eye on the truck as it grew closer. But something about the truck was off. It was moving impossibly fast, closing the distance between them in seconds. Mark gripped the wheel as the truck swerved erratically, its horn blaring loudly. The sound was deafening, almost otherworldly. Mark tried to speed up, but no matter how fast he drove, the truck stayed right behind them, its engine growling like a beast. The horn blared again, and the truck's headlights flashed, flooding the car with blinding light. "Pull over!" Lisa screamed, her voice trembling. Mark swerved onto the shoulder, but instead of passing them, the truck came to a screeching halt behind their car. The horn blasted one last time before the truck's headlights flickered and went out. They sat frozen, staring into the darkness. The massive truck had vanished. Mark and Lisa were both too scared to get out of the car, so they sped away, leaving the spot behind. When they reached the next town, they stopped at a diner to calm their nerves. They told their story to the waitress, an older woman who had lived in the area her whole life. She nodded grimly. "That's the Phantom Truck," she said. "They say it's the ghost of a trucker who died in a fiery crash on Route 666 decades ago. He was known for reckless driving, and now he haunts the highway, chasing anyone who dares to cross his path." Mark and Lisa finished their trip, but avoided Route 666 from then on. Story: The Rest Stop Shadow. In 2015, Claire, a nurse working the night shift, was driving home from a late conference in Oregon. The highway was deserted, stretching endlessly through a thick forest. Exhausted from the long day, Claire decided to pull into a small, isolated rest stop to stretch her legs and grab a snack from the vending machine. The rest stop was eerily quiet, with only one other car parked far off in the shadows. The street lights flickered as she got out of her car, and the cold night air sent a chill down her spine. She felt uneasy but shrugged it off as her nerves. Claire approached the vending machine, fumbling for change. As she fed coins into the slot, she heard the faint crunch of gravel behind her. She froze and glanced over her shoulder. No one was there. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind or an animal, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She grabbed her snack and hurried back to her car. As she slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, she glanced into the rearview mirror and screamed. A dark, shadowy figure was standing in the distance, just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just watching her. Heart racing, Claire started the car and peeled out of the rest stop. She drove as fast as she could, not daring to look back. But a few miles down the road, her headlights briefly illuminated something on the side of the highway, a figure standing perfectly still, just like the one she had seen at the rest stop. When she reached her home, Claire locked all the doors and windows, still shaking from the encounter. She later learned that the rest stop was infamous for strange sightings. Locals told her about a man who had been murdered there years ago, his body left in the woods nearby. Since then, travelers have reported seeing a shadowy figure that seems to follow them, as if it's searching for justice or company. Claire vowed never to stop at a rest area at night again, and her terrifying experience became one of many chilling tales about haunted highways. Story: The Woman in the Rearview Mirror. In 2017, Emily, a young journalist, was driving home late at night after covering a story in a small rural town. The road was long and winding, surrounded by dense woods. It was the kind of highway where you could go miles without seeing another car or even a streetlight. She had been driving for about an hour when fatigue started to set in. To keep herself awake, she turned on the radio, but static crackled through the speakers. Frustrated, she turned it off and focused on the road ahead. As she drove through a particularly dark stretch, she felt a strange sensation, like she wasn't alone. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she adjusted the rearview mirror and froze. In the mirror, she saw a woman sitting in the back seat of her car. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her dark hair hung limply around her shoulders. She was wearing a tattered white dress. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart pounding. She glanced over her shoulder, but when she looked back, the back seat was empty. She tried to convince herself she was just tired, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the uneasy feeling lingered. A few miles down the road, she adjusted the mirror again. And there she was. The woman was closer this time, leaning forward, her face inches away from Emily's. "Don't look back," the woman whispered. Her voice was cold, almost a hiss. Panicked, Emily slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. She jumped out of the car, her hands shaking, and frantically checked the back seat. It was empty. She stood there in the silence, the cool night air biting at her skin, and stared into the dark forest surrounding the highway. Gathering her courage, she got back in the car and sped away, determined not to stop until she reached the next town. When she arrived, Emily told her story to the clerk at a gas station. He listened intently, his face grim. "You're not the first to see her," he said. "They call her the Woman in White. She died on this road decades ago, in a car crash. Some say she appears to warn drivers. Others think she's looking for the car that killed her." Emily never took that road again and made sure to always check her back seat before getting into her car. Thank you for joining us on this haunting ride. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story here at Creepy Corner Stories. Good night, and drive carefully.